Okay, it is 7:29, so we've got about 30 minutes until class starts. Your first word for attendance is going to be mirror, like the shiny thing you look at your reflection in. So mirror is the first word for attendance. Go ahead and take a screenshot right now, because as usual, when you're done watching the video, you're going to send the list of attendance words. You're going to send take a screenshot each time I say an attendance word, and you're going to email all that in to get your credit. Also, as usual, at the end of it, the last attendance word or phrase, if you want to call it that, will be to ask any question about the material covered in this video. So basically, it's just things going as usual. So I guess that's it. It is now 7:30. So if you want to, if you're watching this on a video, you can go ahead and fast forward about 30 minutes into the video, and you should be where you need to be. Morning.
Morning.
Your weekend.
It was pretty good. How about you?
Okay. Nothing good or bad happened. Nice neutral weekend. I'll take it. How your other classes going?
My classes are actually fairly easy so far, so it's
Good.
not that bad.
My opinion, this class is it's always harder in the beginning. I think because there's just so much you're learning logistically just about the class itself. Like, where do I find a pre-lab? How do I turn in a pre-lab?
And I kind of got confused with the prelim, so it was like, I was like, oh, okay.
So that's normal. Let's see. Let's count. Excuse me. Once again, you get a little extra credit for being the first one here. Morning.
Morning.
Brody, right?
Yeah.
How was your weekend?
Pardon?
How was your weekend?
Oh, busy. I'm in 19 credit hours.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was busy too. For
I,
university reasons.
yeah, I tried to jump a few weeks ahead because our fall ball starts today.
Oh, okay.
So, all the classes I could, I jumped.
Good thinking. I also teach early enrollment courses and they start in a week or two. So I'm dreading that. Usually, like I've done it for years and there's always like 4 students max in each class. This time there were so many students that they had to open up a different section. So I'm just gonna be so busy, so busy. It's one of the reasons I made those discussions extra credit, because no one does them. It helps me. It's one less thing to grade. Good morning. It's over?
Yep.
Um, Rumfeld. Rumfeld yet, okay. Champion. No. Gorby. Gross. Hill. The other Hill, sorry. No. Gracie. Sigmund. Slaughter. Tompkins. Chip. The Nest. Watson. Young. No Young. Yeah. Zweibeck. Lawrence. All right, well, I've said everybody, I went through the roster. What's your last name?
Wilson.
What is it?
Wilson.
Interesting. First name?
Gordon.
Oh, yeah, did I just email you?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so with that email, like I said, there's that link that shows the old videos from last week. You should definitely watch those and get caught up. And your last name, sorry.
Jack.
Jackson? Oh, hey, there you go. Same thing for you then. I mean, I know you were here Friday, but those old videos you should get caught up. Morning. Brumfield. Champion? Oh, yeah. Gorby. Gross. Gracie. Last name Keys. Sigmund. Stowe, oh no, I guess we're ready to go. Watson. Wait, wrong Watson, I guess. Young. Zweibeck. Lawrence. What's the last name? I'll wait till you say.
Hill.
Oh, the other Hill, yeah. We are recording, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. And then whoever watches the videos later can benefit from your questions.
Nice and easy.
I was just telling some of your classmates earlier that I teach early enrollment classes, and they haven't started yet. They start in the next couple of weeks, and I have at least 30 more students I'm going to be teaching. So I'm going to be really, really busy in the next couple of weeks. So I give a lot of feedback in the first of the week, or the first week of the semester. But moving forward, I'm probably going to give a lot less feedback unless you ask for it. I just won't have the time to offer everybody feedback. And some people really just don't give a crap anyway. So if you want feedback, I'd love to give it to you. So let me know. Like if you get a grade, like why did I get that grade? What's wrong with it? Let me know. We can meet online. And as a reminder, you get a 5% boost to any grade for an assignment if you meet me online to get detailed feedback. Perez, right? Yeah. So yeah, let me know. And again, to remind you that the discussions, remember last week I changed it to where those discussions are technically extra credit now. Now, in the system, I can't change it. So when you look at your grade on WVSU Online, it's going to show your grade based on the discussions as well. So just know, like when I do midterms, for example, upload your grades to midterms, it might be lower than your actual grade is. I'm not going to make that adjustment until the end of the semester. I'd rather you be pleasantly surprised about your grade, like all of a sudden jumping up at the end as opposed to all of a sudden jumping down. All right, back to the top here. No. Gracie? Is Gracie here yet? No? That's a good guess. Slaughter's not here, right? Okay. Smith is not here yet. Watson? Watson here yet? No? Okay. Young? Gotcha. Young is here. Zweiback? Gotcha. Lawrence? Here. Gracie? Yeah. Gotcha. Anybody not been called yet? Still have a couple minutes. Anybody do anything particularly fun over the weekend? Any bad stuff happen over the weekend? That's good too. Anybody travel over the weekend? That's as boring as I was this weekend.
I bought a goldfish.
There we go. That's something. Sadly, that's the most exciting thing. It sounds like to anyone. Have you had to go fish before? Okay.
Yeah, I just really like them. I had a lot more fish and animals and stuff, but then I did a big move.
Mm.
So I had to get rid of a lot of them, but
That stinks.
Yeah.
Did you name your goldfish?
one of them's name is Achilles and the other one's name is Coleslaw.
God, I like that. All right. Feel free to write any kind of extra credit papers about your goldfish if you want, like their taxonomic classification, where goldfish are native, how long they typically live, how big they typically get, things like that. Speaking of goldfish, and I guess I could have put this up here, there's an online version of the lab that we're gonna do this week. And I'll share the link with you later, but that online version, you can do it for extra credit. And it's a goldfish lab. Basically, you virtually change the temperature of the water and you count how many times the fish is breathing and you determine if the temperature of the water affects the respiration rate. So again, I'll share that with you later. It's 8 o'clock. We'll go ahead and officially get started. From the top, Brumfeld is here, Champion is here, Gorby is not here, Gross is not here, Gunther is here, both Hills are here, Jackson is here, Gracie is here, Perez is here, Sigmund is here, Slaughter is not here, making sure, Smith is here now, Stover is here, Tompkins is here, Vanessa is here, Watson, not here. Young is here, Zweiback is here, Lawrence is here, and that's it. And then, of course, there's a new name. So anybody not accounted for? All right, let's do announcements and reminders. So as usual, again, if you're here in person, you don't have to send in the attendance word. That's just extra credit for you if you do. If you're online watching this, no one is online, so we'll double check that. Yeah, no one's online, so if you're watching this video at a later date and you're trying to claim your extra credit, not only do you need to send the words, but again, send the screenshot every time I say one of the words. And again, as usual, the last word for attendance is going to be asking a question about the material covered in this lecture. So the first word for attendance, if you want to call it that, is 9 a.m. So again, if you're watching the video, it should be a screenshot. It'll be pointing at the word 9 a.m. That's the first word for attendance. So the pre-labs are past due. Usually they're due on Friday. I extended the due date because I didn't really show you how to do it until Friday, so that would have been fair. So the due date was extended to Sunday. Now they are past due. Normally that just means if you haven't turned it in yet, it just means you can't come to lab normally. But again, it's the first week, so I'm trying to be a little bit more lenient. So if you haven't done the pre-lab yet, you can still do it. Just make sure you get it done today. The only catch is you're either going to lose points for turning it in late, or anything that says extra credit, do it because it's not extra credit for you anymore. So there's like 2 videos for you. You'll need to watch those 2 videos and answer the questions. I think that might be it, actually. So your punishment, if you want to call it that, for missing the due date is just doing a little bit of extra work. Any questions about that? All right. Speaking of pre-labs, again, pre-lab 2 will be due this Friday. As always, you don't have to do these alone. I'm happy to meet you online and walk you through it. I want you to learn it, right? This isn't it's not a test. It almost seems like a test, right? Because it almost seems like I'm saying, here, do this on your own and give it to me when you're done so I can see how you did. It doesn't have to be that way. I'm trying to teach you. In a perfect world, we would sit down and all do the pre-lab together and I can teach it to you. But it's not a perfect world, but I will do that if you want. And also, I'm happy to look over your assignments before you turn them in. Like I was saying earlier, I'm about to be really, really busy this semester. So if I can just look over your assignments, like if you give me 3 minutes to look them over, that'll help me. It'll save me so much time. Because then I can point out any huge mistakes that you made. I'm like, oh, you're going to lose a lot of points. You're going to want to fix that. It's so much quicker for me to do that than actually having to, grade your assignments and leave feedback and all that. So please let me help you. Lab is this Wednesday. It's the first time we're meeting from lab from 9 to 10:50. It's not really a dangerous lab at all, but as you're going to learn, technically you should have pants and closed-toed shoes for all labs. Even though this one, again, there's no real safety hazards, but anyway, try to remember that. Another reminder, this is the first time I've told you this, I think, but there will be no school, no class, no lecture a week from today, because it's Labor Day. You can come if you want, I won't be here. And then the following Friday, after that Monday, I'm gonna be traveling, so my office hours are going to be online only. So if you're gonna need me, meet me online. I'll be in a vehicle, but I'm still holding office hours. So any questions about announcements, reminders? Do you guys have any announcements? Okay, first football game is this Saturday, right? Somewhere else, where did you say it was again? Yeah. So most of us probably can't make it, but if you're not on the football team and you make it, you can get extra credit for going. Anyway, let's jump back into it then, if there's no questions. We were still talking about science. Remember, because the first thing, basically one of the first things I taught you that you needed to know is that biology is the science that studies life, right? So once we define biology, then we kind of define life, right? We talked about what life is, and we talked about the properties of life and the organization of life. Then once we've defined that, then we kind of moved on to talking about science, right? Because again, biology is the science that studies life. So let's talk about science some more. Excuse me. Okay. There we go. Hey, it's working. Okay, you definitely need to know what a hypothesis is. This is definitely a test question. I mean, really, this whole course is all about hypotheses. Because every lab you do, you're going to be testing a hypothesis, at least one hypothesis. It's all about hypotheses. So what is a hypothesis? It's a suggested explanation for an event. I think that's your book definition. And then the old textbook, and I prefer this, is a tentative answer to a question. So you definitely need to know that bullet point. Actually, yeah, this whole thing, all these little bullet points. You also need to know that a hypothesis has to be able to be tested and falsified. So using an example that I used last week, when we talked about the scope of science and the limitations of science, I cannot say, or a proper hypothesis would not be, God does not exist. That would not be a scientific hypothesis because I can't test that. You cannot falsify that statement. Also, as a reminder, someone just reminded me, all these PowerPoints, you can find them online. So the PowerPoints can be found on WVSU Online. You have access to it. I also like to point out that a hypothesis is not necessarily an educated guess. Growing up, that's what I always heard. A hypothesis is an educated guess. And that is kind of true. But that in itself isn't enough, right? Because like, again, you have to be able to test it, you have to be able to falsify it, things like that. So that's a hypothesis. Let's talk about theory. And this is the part that people get really confused on. Most people, I think, based on the interactions I have outside of this class, I don't think people know what a theory is. Based on the way they use the word theory, like, oh, it's just a theory. But a theory is a generally accepted a generally accepted scientific theory has been thoroughly tested and confirmed. And it's a set of observations or phenomena. So basically, it's well established, right? So the theory of evolution is well established. So again, when people use the word theory, they're not usually using it the right way. Usually they mean hypothesis. So like if, I don't know, some food goes missing in the house, the mom and dad are saying, I wonder what happened. And the dad says, oh, I've got a theory. I had the youngest ones snuck those cookies to their bedroom. But that's not a theory, that's a hypothesis, right? A theory is much more broad, much more concrete. And that finally brings us to a scientific law. Laws are often expressed in mathematical formulas, and they describe how nature will behave under specific conditions. So for the exam, you should know all three of these. For the semester, probably the most important thing are hypotheses, because that's really what we're going to be dealing with, is hypotheses. And be testing hypotheses. That's what science is all about. As a matter of fact, if you want to test your own hypotheses, if you do your own experiments, let me know. You can get extra credit for that. And I can help you set up the experiment. And of course, these things don't have to apply just to science. Well, formally just to science, and we'll talk about that later. I'll give some examples of how you actually use hypotheses in your everyday life, and you just might not think of it. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about theories, because again, it's very important that people understand what a theory actually is. In this next slide, this information I'm going to show you does not come from your textbook. It comes from the old textbook. So again, if you're going to study it, if you're going to take notes, you might take a note and say, this is not in the textbook. I need to study it using the PowerPoint. Speaking of which, everybody cool with me going forward? Everybody good? Don't want to go too fast. All right. Theory, the comprehensive, well-substantiated explanation, and it's broader in scope than a hypothesis. So there's going to be at least one test question where you're kind of comparing and contrasting a theory with a hypothesis. So a theory is much bigger, and I'll give some examples, and that'll make sense on the next slide. But for now, let's just leave it at that, right? Theory is bigger, it's broader in scope. A hypothesis is very specific. Theory, much more broad. A theory is only widely accepted if it's supported by a large, varied, growing body of evidence. So again, a theory it's pretty well established, unlike the way people use the word in common English. It's just a theory. It's not the proper term. A theory is used to explain many observations and devise new and testable hypotheses. I'll give an example of that on the next slide. But again, there will be a test question, at least one, where you're kind of comparing and contrasting hypotheses and theories, like how are they related? Well, that's another way they're related, right? So with a theory, you can make very specific hypotheses based on a theory. Like, all right, we know this big thing, and that means we can know these little smaller things based on what we know. Like any scientific idea, theories must be refined or abandoned. New contradictory evidence is discovered. So there are some examples of that. You can look them up for more independent work or extra credit if you want. Like what are some biological theories that have been abandoned? Like there was a time when everybody thought, yep, this is the case. And then they discovered, nope, that's not the case. So look that up if you want. I'm not going to test you on it, but yeah, you can write papers on it for extra credit if you want. Any questions about what a theory is before I give you an example that kind of demonstrates that relationship between a hypothesis and a theory? Okay. The next word for attendance is going to be lighthouse. Even though you can't really tell in the picture, that's a lighthouse. So again, if you're watching the video, your screenshot of me pointing at that lighthouse. And of course, the list of words too. Anyway, here's some two seemingly unrelated hypotheses, right? The first hypothesis states that long, thin roots are an adaptation that helps some plants survive in an urban habitat. Now, granted, that's not really urban, but it's a lighthouse and it's concrete, and that tree is growing in a crack between the lighthouse and the bottom, the pavement at the bottom, the concrete at the bottom. So it probably has long, thin roots that it evolved. The second hypothesis, and there's no picture for this, the unusual bone structure in hummingbirds' wings is an evolutionary adaptation that provides an advantage in gathering nectar from flowers. So there we have two seemingly unrelated hypotheses. But in contrast, the following theory ties together these seemingly unrelated hypotheses. And the theory is, and this is a real theory, and this is just, by the way, these are just examples, so you don't need to write any of this down. Adaptations to the local environment evolved by natural selection. So that is the theory of natural selection. Of course, that's often worded a little bit differently depending on your source, but basically that's it. So based on that one theory, you can come up with different hypotheses. Like I hypothesize that in 100 years, deer are going to have better hearing, because the ones that can't hear well are usually getting hit by cars or shot by hunters, right? So they're not passing their genes along. And those who happen to have slightly better hearing, they're probably going to survive. They're going to pass those genes along. So I just now formulated a hypothesis, very specific hypothesis, based on this theory of evolution. And again, these are just examples. You don't need to know anything about roots or hummingbirds, or anything like that. And you don't need to know anything about evolution or natural selection yet. That comes later in the semester. Anyway, so any questions about this? All right, here's another thing that's not in your textbook. I'm not sure if I'm going to test you on it or not, but it is important. This is from the old textbook, so I kept it. What is a fact, right? What is a fact? A fact is a piece of information that is considered objectively true and can be based on all current evidence. Objectively true, right? So I could say a fact would be Los Agaves is 3 miles from here, because I'm not sure if that's exactly correct, but let's assume it is. That could be a fact, right? That would be, assuming it's true, it's objectively true. It can be verified, right? We can measure that. We can look it up on the internet. I can verify the fact that Los Agaves is 3 miles from here. It's different than opinions, right? Because again, it's objectively true. So if I were to say Los Agaves has the best margaritas in the area, that's not a fact, right? That's an opinion, because it's not objectively true. That would be subjectively true. That's my opinion. Now, granted, sometimes you can, use science to collect data to, look to see if an opinion is shared by a lot of people, right? We could do a poll and see, hey, who's got the best margarita in town? Still, it would just be opinions, but opinions that a lot of people share. A lot of people associate facts with science, as they should, because when we collect data, that's facts, right? But that's not the primary goal of science. So, for example, the old textbook had used an example of phone books. Of course, those really don't even exist anymore. I don't know if you guys remember phone books, but it's just a book that has names and phone numbers, maybe even addresses. It's been a while since I've seen it. Just a bunch of facts, right? There's a bunch of facts in a phone book, but that's not science, right? Accumulating facts is not science. It's used in science, but that in itself isn't science. Right? You have to use those facts to answer questions. And somebody asked this question last week with the attendance words. That's what we mean by inquiry-based, right? So remember last week I said science is inquiry-based, meaning it's all about answering questions. So we're using these facts to answer questions. And another example I'll give before I move forward is my own thesis, right? So I was trying to find the genes responsible for plants having trichomes. So those little hairs. So I collected a lot of facts in doing that. Like I looked at, it's kind of hard to explain yet, you'll get it later, but I looked at how RNA was being produced, right? And I collected all these facts, like this gene was very active, this gene was not very active, like thousands of genes, I looked at them, and that's just a bunch of facts. But that didn't mean anything until we looked at those facts and used that to answer questions. Like, all right, these genes must be involved somehow because they were very active. Anyway, that's just an example. Any questions about a fact? All right, this is also not from your textbook. I'm also not going to test you on this, but here's another example from the old textbook. Newton, Darwin, Einstein, right? They're really famous scientists. And they stand out in science not because they had a bunch of facts, but because their theories had broad explanatory power. So they were answering big questions, and that's what made them famous. Anyway, again, just an example. I'm not going to test you on that. So back to the textbook. Let's talk about natural sciences. I'll put a question mark next to this, because I really don't think I have questions about this on the exam. This is still just kind of like the introduction. We're not really getting into biology yet. We're still, again, just talking about what science is. Now we're going to get specific, talk about what natural sciences are. These are sciences that are related to physical world and its phenomena. So basically, and this is an example from your textbook. I like the way they say this. You can just think of a natural science museum. All the stuff you would see in a natural science museum, those are natural sciences. Obviously, biology falls into that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it. Things like astronomy, physics, chemistry, math, geology. Like I said, I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you any questions on this, but if I do, I'm not going to ask you that. I'm not going to ask you to list the natural sciences or anything like that. Any questions about this? Okay. Natural sciences. You can take notes. I'll wait a second. We still talk a little bit more about natural sciences before we move forward. There is no complete agreement like your textbook points out, when it comes to defining what the natural sciences include. So yes, I did give you some examples previously. Those examples came from your textbook. Again, you don't need to know those examples. And I do like the fact that your book points this out, right? It's like not necessarily complete agreement on what is natural science and what is not. Some people even divide natural sciences into the life sciences and the physical sciences. Again, I'm probably not going to ask you this either. But life sciences, obviously, study living things, and that includes biology. Then you have your physical science, so looking at non-living things, right? So astronomy, physics, chemistry. Of course, we do use physics and chemistry in biology. Actually, for you guys, we're going to use chemistry and biology. Technically, physics or chemistry is all about physics, and then biology is all about chemistry. But don't worry, we're not going to have that much chemistry in this course. You're going to learn about it in the next chapter. It'll be going on in the background. Anything we talk about in this class really boils down to chemistry, but we won't be looking at it from that lens. So anyway, any questions about this? All right. Who knows the difference between, or who can tell me the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? Don't feel bad if you don't know. Nobody? All right, you'll definitely need to know this for the exam. If you download this PowerPoint, I think, yeah, that's a link. If you click on that link, that's a little video that kind of does a better job of explaining inductive and deductive reasoning. I have to admit, this is one of my Achilles heels, and I'm not talking about her goldfish. This one of those things, I'm just really not good at explaining this. I mean, I'm not bad at it, but there's other things I'm better at, and this is not one of them. So inductive reasoning, it uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion. It involves formulating generalizations inferred from careful observations and the analysis of a large amount of data. You're going from specific to general. That's probably the more important bullet point is that last one. One of your online counterparts, so a student who's taking this class but taking it online, they are doing the discussion, and that's not extra credit for them, so they're required to. But anyway, one of them had a great example, and I'm going to use it from now on. She said something like, her mom, no, what was it? Her dad and her uncle, every time they watch Home Alone, the movie Home Alone, they just laugh so hard that they cry. So she said, so with inductive reasoning, based on that specific information, I'm going to generalize and say all male humans think Home Alone is funny. Right? Of course, that's not true, but that's how inductive reasoning could work, right? She has very specific examples, so she's going to make broad conclusions. Now that I think about it, I mean, this could really get into social discussions with this, right? That's probably all kinds of isms, racism, sexism, right? There you go. You would be specific. I've seen this group of people. Every time I've seen this group of people, they do this bad thing. Therefore, in my mind, everybody who's in that group of people do these bad things, right? So that's inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is the opposite. This is what we use in hypothesis-based science. That's one. So again, this is what we're going to be using throughout the semester. It's the opposite, again, of inductive reasoning because we're going from general to specific. So there might be, again, just one test question about this on the exam. I think the key thing here is to know that we're using deductive reasoning. And again, click on that PowerPoint if you watch a video of somebody explaining it. But the good news is, even if you don't remember this and you brain dump it, the worst that's going to happen is you miss one question on the test. So like you don't need to know the definition of deductive reasoning to use deductive reasoning, I guess is what I'm saying. So that's the good news. Even if you can't remember exactly how it's defined, you still should have no problem using deductive reasoning. All right. We'll move forward. The next word for attendance is going to be, well, no, here we go. I'm going to change things up a little bit. It's almost like a quiz. The next word for attendance is either going to be inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning, and you choose which one. And the question is, between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, which one are we going to be using in this class? So the next word for attendance is either going to be inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. Anyway, there are two main pathways of scientific studies. We've got descriptive science and we have hypothesis-based science. You might have a question about this on the exam. Descriptive science aims to observe, explore, and discover. So I think some of the famous scientists you might see on TV, because you guys are very young, and even this person was old for me. Does anybody know Jane Goodall? Does anybody recognize that name? Okay. So Jane Goodall lived with primates, right? Was observing primates. She wasn't necessarily testing any hypotheses, but she was out there observing and collecting data. That's descriptive science. Hypothesis-based science is what we're going to be doing. And it begins with a specific question or problem, and it looks for a potential answer or solution that can be tested. So again, like I mentioned earlier when I first brought this word up, hypothesis, science, in this class especially, it's all about testing hypotheses. All about answering questions. And of course, the boundary between the two often overlap. So, if you're out there, for example, I don't know, if you're just into sharks and you go out in the ocean and you're just taking a lot of data, a lot of observations about sharks, and you're tagging them and tracking them on GPS and things like that, you might not be answering a specific question at first, but then after observing them and collecting data, you might come up with some questions like, wait, why is it that these sharks always go to this spot this time of year? What is it about that? Then you start getting into hypothesis-based questions or science, right? Then you're trying to figure out something. Why? Why do they do that? What's causing that? Of course, the shark thing is just an example. You don't need to know that for the exam. Any questions about this slide? Okay. The next slide is going to be even more important, both for the exam and for just what you need to understand for just the semester. And the next slide is going to talk about the scientific method. Before we talk about it, I will point this out. I'm pretty sure your book points this out. It's great. It's important to say this. The scientific method is just a general guideline. So it's not necessarily set in stone. Also, depending on your source, it might look different, right? So our textbook, I've written down what the textbook says right there. The old textbook wrote it a little differently. You could look up any source and you'll probably find a slightly different version of it. But generally speaking, it's the same thing. And again, like I said, it's a general guideline. For example, I'm sure you guys have already read the pre-lab and done the pre-lab. So when we do this lab this week, I guess I'm going to try to say we don't start with an observation, but we do. I kind of force you to do an observation. We all stand up and pull our hands out. And everybody's going to look at how tall everybody is in their hands. But anyway, a lot of the labs that we're going to do in this semester don't start with an observation. They start with a question. Like when we do the photosynthesis and respiration lab, one of the experiments we're going to do is looking at different colors of light and how that affects the rate of photosynthesis. So there was no observation there. I'm just telling you that's the question that you're going to answer. So again, it's just a general guideline. But anyway, let's talk about the general guideline and learn what your textbook says about it, because that's what I'm going to test you on. Again, the first step is an observation, right? So you observe something. Like the example I just gave previously about the sharks, you observe that these particular species of shark go to this particular location same time every year. That's the observation, and that leads to a question. Why? Why do those sharks go there same time every year? Hypothesis, I don't know. Because they like to go there that time of year because it's the rainy season and a lot of fresh water is being, put into the ocean at that spot, and this particular species of shark likes a little bit of fresh water. I don't know. But that's a hypothesis, right? I could test that. Here's where people get a little confused. And this is important for the exam, a little bit for the exam, but also more important for the labs, because you will be dealing with this a lot. A prediction is something that's based on a hypothesis. So you have your hypothesis, but then a prediction
will describe basically how you're going to test your hypothesis. It's an if-then statement that describes how you're going to test your hypothesis. And if you're doing things right, like in real science, not a 100 level non-biology major course, but if you're really doing science and trying to figure something out, and you're trying to test a hypothesis, you would come up with different ways to test your hypothesis. And the example I give on the online version of our lab is dog urine, right? So let's say you observe that the spot in your yard where your dog pees, that's usually nicer grass than the other spot. That's your observation. Your question then is dog urine good for grass? And your hypothesis may be, yes, dog urine is good for grass. Then you're going to come up with some predictions to help test your hypothesis. So if I have my dog stop urinating in that part of the yard, then the grass won't be as green, right? That's one way I can test my prediction. If I have my dog pee in some other that spot in the yard, then that spot's going to be greener. If I collect urine and give a set of plants pure water and get another set of plants half water and half urine and give another set of plants pure urine, then the set of plants getting the pure urine will grow taller than the others, right? All these different ways of testing my hypothesis. So don't confuse these. You'll be okay in the first lab, but later in the semester, if something asks for your hypothesis, don't give a prediction, right? You don't need an if-then statement if it's asking for a hypothesis. Conversely, if a question is asking you for a prediction, give the prediction, not the hypothesis. So any questions so far? Observation, question, hypothesis, predictions. All right. So again, the prediction kind of describes the experiment, right? Like I said, have the dog pee in that part of the yard. That could be an experiment. Experiments are when we actually test the hypothesis. Here's an important one. Definitely know this. You'll never lose points for this in this 100 level class, but I will correct you. People make this mistake all the time. An experiment does not technically prove that a hypothesis is correct. You might lose like 1 point for that when you do your lab report. If you say, the data proves that my hypothesis was correct. It does not. So the more data we have, basically what we're saying is it supports your hypothesis, right? An experiment can support a hypothesis. It can say that there's a really high probability that this hypothesis is correct. And that's where we get into statistics, which we don't even cover in this course. But yeah, so technically we don't use the word prove in this course. We're not proving anything to be correct. So, any questions about experiment? All right, you guys seem tired. Next is analyze, right? So in the experiment, you're collecting all this data, right? You're taking all these measurements. Then you need to analyze that data to see if it did support your hypothesis or not. And again, usually, almost always in real science, that involves statistics. But this is a 100 level class, so we will not be using statistics. But here's a hint, because you're going to see this question a lot on labs. Sometimes a lab will ask you, how could this experiment be improved? And that's not me as your professor who's truly interested in making things better for you. I do ask that too. But when that question that comes up, that means if you're a scientist and you want to publish these results, how could you make this experiment better? And one of the easiest answers you can always give is more data, right? Because again, even though we don't use stats, we don't use statistics, technically, usually the more data you have, the better. The more likely your hypothesis is correct. So yeah, more data. As a matter of fact, that might be a lab question for this lab, I don't remember. And that would be an answer. So we're gonna measure all of us, right? You're gonna measure your height and your finger span. But we can't publish that. We can't say based on what we find that all humans, there's a correlation or not a correlation, whatever we find. But if we had more people, we could. More data. Anyway, then the last step is report. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that later. But you guys just, for you, reporting your results is gonna be turning in your lab or lab report in one instance. That's it. So again, know the steps of the scientific method. This is sort of like when we talked about the levels of organization, right? So 100 level class is a multiple choice exam. So you're not gonna have any test questions where I ask you to list it off, right? I just list all the steps. but you should recognize if anything's out of order or if anything's missing, right? That's how the test questions are gonna go, right? Like I'll give you the whole list of the scientific method and I'll leave something out and say, which step is missing? Or I'll give you the whole list and have some of them out of order and I'll say, which one of these is out of order? Things like that. So any questions? All right. Let's keep talking a little bit about experiments. Again, this is what lab is all about, is experiments. We do a lot of experiments. So the next slide is gonna be a better explanation, but we'll start with this one because this is from your textbook and I like to teach out of the textbook. Experiment uses one or more variables. You need to know what a variable is. A variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during the experiment. So in the dog urine example I gave, the variables would be the urine itself, right? Especially that last example I gave where they have different concentrations of urine. Another variable would be, or depending on how we measure the grass, right? It could be the height of the grass, the color of the grass, whatever. But that would be the variables. An experiment often also has a control, not always, especially in our labs. But a control does not vary. So for example, again, if I were doing the dog urine experiment, the last one I talked about, where I had a set of potted plants that got pure water, a set of potted plants that got half water, half urine, and then a different set of plants that got pure urine. Some controls would be things like the soil. I want to make sure they all have the same type of soil. Otherwise, how do I know the difference is because of the urine or the different types of soil? I want to have the different types, same type of plants, right? That would be a control. We want to make sure that those plants get the same amount of sunlight, right? Those are things that we need to control. That way we only have the variables that we are testing, right? Everything else, we don't want it to be variable. We want it to be controlled so that we know the results are due to the variables. And again, many aspects of this will be explored in lab. So you're getting exposed to it now, but you're really gonna come to learn it and appreciate it in labs. So any questions about this slide before I give you a better example that's from the old textbook? All right, from the old textbook, here we go. To test a hypothesis, you have to run tests multiple times with one factor changing. And again, you want to keep all other factors held constant, right? You only want to change one factor at a time. Everything else you want to be controlled. Again, using a dog urine experiment, if we had a bunch of potted plants and they were all different in different soil, and I did get different results, then I would have to say, was that due to the different dog urine concentration? Or is it because they're in different pots and different soil? So again, here we go from the old textbook. A variable is a factor that changes in an experiment. Controlled experiment, and again, this is not a new textbook, so I'm going to circle it just to remind you. You might have done this for the exam, and it's not in the textbook. It's in this PowerPoint, which you can get on WBSU Online. Controlled experiment is one that compares two or more groups that differ only in one variable that the experiment is designed to test. So again, the dog urine example. If I were to do that experiment, I would want everything to be the same other than the concentration of the urine that I'm getting. I would even make sure that they're getting watered at the same time every day. At the same temperature too, right? So we don't want fresh, warm urine for some plants and then cold water for other plants, right? So everything, you try to make sure everything is identical other than that variable that you're trying to test. That brings us to the control group. You already know what a control is. So a control group is a group that lacks or does not receive the specific factor being tested. So in that example, the control group would be the set of plants that's getting pure water. Not half urine, not full urine, just pure water. That way, like let's say the control group, let's say they all died, including the control group. If we didn't have a control group, we might say, man, dog urine is actually killing these plants. But we had the control group that wasn't getting dog urine, and if those plants died too, there's obviously something else going on. And then finally, that brings us to the experimental group. And the experimental group is the one that has or receives the specific factor being tested. So one last time in that example, those plants that are getting various concentrations of dog urine, that's your experiment group. Control group would be the one getting water. I will point this out too. In this semester, some of these experiments we do, not all of them have control groups and experiment. Well, yeah, let's leave it at that. They don't all have control groups. Then we'll talk about that when the time comes. Any questions so far? All right, the next slide is really important. I don't even know why your textbook doesn't have it. This is very important. You're going to need to know this for almost every single lab, and you're probably going to be testing on it. You definitely need to know the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And they can be tricky, but it's in the name. The dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So again, sorry to beat a dead horse, but with the urine, that hypothetical urine experiment, the concentration of the urine would be the independent variable, and the height of the plant could be the dependent variable. Because what we're saying, what I'm testing there, is to see, does the urine affect the growth rate of plants, right? So in that case, the height of the plant would be dependent on the concentration of urine that I'm giving. So again, the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. Any questions about that? All right. So again, make sure you know that. It's very important. Also, a little side note, you're going to need to know this to learn about this, that you probably already have in this week's experiment. When you're graphing something, the independent variable is always on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and the dependent variable is always on the y-axis. So again, with the same old experiment that I keep referencing, if we were measuring the height of plants based on the concentration of urine, this is where we would have the height, right? This is where we would have the concentration of the urine. Pretty simple, right? Independent variable here, dependent variable there. Any questions about that? All right, some more information not from your textbook. Let's talk about different types of controlled experiments. I'm almost definitely not going to test you on this information I'm about to give you, but it is important to know just for everyday life, because again, one day, unfortunately, you or somebody you love might have some kind of disease, and you're going to need to study about this disease. So some of this terminology is things you're going to need to understand if you're going to understand this disease. So does anybody know what a placebo is? Placebo.
Is like the control group what you give to like the people, like if you're trying a medicament, you give like some people the placebo and some people the medicament to see if it actually works.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll give some examples and get a little bit more specific. Yeah, in medical drug trials, they use something called a placebo. And basically, like she just described, it's a medically ineffective treatment. So if I wanted to see if this new drug that I came up with, I don't know, makes their hair grow faster, then I would have a bunch of people that I'm giving different concentrations of that drug. The one group would get a placebo. So they're still taking a pill, just like everyone else. But for that, it would be a fake pill. It wouldn't actually have the drug. That's what a placebo is. And, as she mentioned, that allows the placebo group to serve as the control group. So that group of people who is getting that pill that's basically nothing, that would be the control group. Because, and I don't have this in writing, there is something called the placebo effect. Does anybody know what that is?
And you think that you actually like is doing something on you.
Yeah, so the placebo effect would be like you're taking a fake pill in this example, but you don't know that it's fake. So in your mind, and the mind's a very powerful thing, you think you're taking the real thing. So maybe you start showing some benefits from this fake drug because your mind thinks it's real. And your mind, kind of controls your body. So that's the placebo effect. Anyway, typically a placebo group doesn't know they're receiving the ineffective substitute. I was just saying, excuse me, fix this. Almost lost it. All right. Anyway, And that brings us to another word that you should know, not for the exam, just in everyday life. It's something called a double-blind experiment, and that's when the participants don't know that they're getting the placebo, but also the people doing the experiment, like physically doing, handing out the medicine, for example, they don't know which group is getting the real treatment or not. Obviously, someone does, but not the people giving the drug, right? That's a double-blind experiment. And again, I'm almost definitely not going to test you on that, but unfortunately, one day you might need to know that. Anyway, that's it for experiments. Well, for now, anyway. I'm going to give you an example. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, I showed you a picture of somebody fixing a bike, and I said the purpose of that picture was trying to illustrate the fact that people use the scientific method a lot, all the time, and you just don't think that you're using the scientific method. So I'm going to give you an example of that. And this example comes from the old textbook. But let's say you get home today, it's Monday, right? So everything was due yesterday or Friday, so maybe you don't have any homework, so you're going to watch the TV. Does anybody even watch TV anymore? My kids do. Anyway, you hit the power button, and the TV does not come on. So what step of the scientific process did I just describe there? You hit the button, nothing happens. The TV doesn't turn on. What step is that? That is the first step.
Observation.
Good, observation, right? You've observed that the TV is not working. So what comes after observation? And literally, what would you do if you were sitting there and you push the button and it did turn on? What's the next step? What is it? That was, let me rephrase it. What's the very next step? 'Cause, yeah, there are some things you would do eventually. The very next step, yeah, question. I think someone said it, right? So you hit the button, nothing happens. So then you start asking questions, right? Why won't my TV turn on? So then what comes after the question? Good, hypothesis. So what are some hypotheses for that situation, right? You hit the button, nothing comes on. What are some hypotheses? Important, I'm going to test you on televisions. I'm not going to do that. But what are some guesses? Like, why do you think when you hit the button, nothing came on? Battery's dead, the remote. Yeah, what else? Yeah, TV might be unplugged, power might be out, TV might be broken, all these different hypotheses, right? But let's go with the battery thing. So again, the hypothesis is the remote batteries are dead. So then you wouldn't actually be doing this and thinking to yourself, all right, what is the scientific method? Let me fix this, right? But you would be doing this, you just wouldn't be thinking you're doing the scientific method, right? So again, if you think their batteries are dead, you would think to yourself, oh, let's change the batteries and see if that fixes it. If you were to formally write that as a prediction, that would be, if I replace the batteries, then the remote will work, right? That's your prediction. And then the experiment will just be doing it. You replace the batteries and you hit the power button and see if it works. Here's what I don't like about this example from your old textbook. Again, in real science, when you do an experiment, even if the experiment does support your results, you usually go back to the drawing board and find a different way. Even if your results do support your hypothesis, you usually go back and find a different way to test your hypothesis. Obviously, in this case, you don't, right? If you replace the batteries and you hit the power button and the TV works, hey, case solved, right? You're done. Now you're going to watch your show. But anyway, obviously, if your hypothesis was not correct, right? You replace the batteries and it didn't turn on, then you're going back to the drawing board, right? Now you need a new hypothesis. The batteries didn't fix it. So now we're going to do like he said. Let's make sure it's plugged in, all those things. Anyway, again, that's just a real good example of how people often use the scientific method. They're just not thinking about it like, oh, I'm doing the scientific method. There's another really long example on the next slide, and we're not going to talk about it, but I kept it on there. That way you can read about it if you download the PowerPoint. It's really long, and again, that's why we're not talking about it. It's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but again, if you're really trying to understand this relationship between hypotheses and predictions and the scientific method and all that, you should read this. Just help it give you another example, but I will not test you on that. Here's some other terms that you might get tested on. Basic science versus applied science. Basic science is also known as pure science, and that's just science for the sake of knowledge. So my thesis work for me was basic science. I just wanted to know which genes were responsible for trichomes. I didn't have any particular goal. They had any idea of what I was gonna do with that knowledge, I just wanted to know, and trying to figure that out, which genes are related, which genes are responsible for this. Applied science is also known as technology, and that's more about problem solving. And very often, they work together. So for example, using my basic science, I narrowed it down a lot, so we now know probably these genes are responsible for trichomes on plants. Now, someone who's doing applied science can take that information and use it, right? So trichomes, little hairs on plants, do things. Like, for example, they help protect plants from being eaten by herbivores, specifically insects. So if you're a farmer, it would benefit you to have plants that have a lot of trichomes. So if somebody's working with applied science, they can use those genes that I discovered, well, we, the team, discovered, and they could put them into plants that don't have them, right? So then they would be hairier, so to speak. Anyway, basic science, applied science, that's the relationship between the two. Any questions about that? Perfect. The last word for attendance, other than the fact that, ask me a question, that's technically the last word, but the last actual word for attendance, I'm gonna say peer. Like I'm pointing out right there. So again, if you're watching the video, take a screenshot of me pointing at the word peer. And that's it. When we come back on Wednesday, we'll pick up where we left off. And I'll be in my office and online for office hours if anybody needs them. You guys have a great week.